The morning Father Thomas Whitmore was found dead in his chambers at St. Augustine Parish in New Orleans. A single name was written in blood on the wooden floor beside him: Sarah. Hello, friends. I'm here to share the story of Father Thomas Whitmore and Sarah, an enslaved woman whose forbidden love would challenge everything the church stood for in the Antebellum South. I hope this story touches your heart as deeply as it touched mine when I first uncovered these details. Now, before we begin, I want to be transparent with you. This narrative is fictionalized. The characters and their names are not real people. But here's what is real. Every event, every situation you're about to hear was a common occurrence during American slavery. These practices were documented extensively in historical records and survivor testimonies. So while the names are invented, the experiences were tragically real for thousands of enslaved people. The forbidden relationships between clergy and enslaved women, the church's involvement in the slave economy, and the devastating consequences of these unions were all documented realities of this dark period. But to understand how Father Whitmore's name came to be written in his own blood, we must go back 3 years earlier to the summer of 1858. Father Thomas Whitmore arrived at St. Augustine Parish on June 12, 1858, a Thursday that would mark the beginning of the end for everything he believed in. He was 32 years old, ordained in Boston, educated at the prestigious seminary of St. Mary's in Baltimore. His letters of recommendation described him as a man of unwavering faith and exceptional devotion to God's word. The Archbishop had sent him to New Orleans specifically because of his reputation for moral rectitude, a quality desperately needed in a city known for its excesses and moral laxity. The parish served a wealthy congregation of plantation owners and merchants. Among them was the Beaumont family, who owned one of the largest sugar plantations in Louisiana, stretching across 1,500 acres along the Mississippi River. Claude Beaumont was a devout Catholic who donated generously to the church, and his family occupied the front pew every Sunday without fail. It was at the Beaumont plantation, during a dinner hosted to welcome the new priest, that Father Whitmore first saw Sarah. She was 23 years old, born on the plantation to a mother who had died in childbirth when Sarah was only 5. Unlike most enslaved people who worked in the fields, Sarah had been raised in the big house, serving as a personal maid to Madame Elise Beaumont. What made Sarah extraordinary was not just her striking appearance, her deep brown eyes and graceful bearing, but something far more dangerous in that time and place: her intelligence. Sarah had taught herself to recognize letters by watching the Beaumont children during their lessons. She would stand by the doorway, pretending to wait for instructions, memorizing the shapes and sounds. At night in the slave quarters, she would practice drawing those letters in the dirt floor with a stick, erasing them before dawn. Reading was forbidden to enslaved people in Louisiana, punishable by whipping or worse. But Sarah was hungry for knowledge, with a desperation that exceeded her fear. That evening, as Father Whitmore blessed the Beaumont family's table, he noticed Sarah standing in the corner of the dining room, holding a silver pitcher of water. Their eyes met for only a moment, but in that brief exchange, something passed between them that neither could name. She looked away quickly, as was expected, but Father Whitmore found himself unable to focus on the conversation around him for the rest of the evening. The next Sunday, Sarah sat in the back pew designated for the Beaumont slaves who were permitted to attend Mass. Father Whitmore delivered his sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan, speaking about seeing the humanity in all people. As he spoke, he found his eyes repeatedly drawn to that back pew, where Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening with an intensity that seemed to absorb every word. After Mass, as the congregation filed out, Sarah approached him with her eyes respectfully lowered. "Father," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for your sermon. Your words about seeing people, truly seeing them. It meant something to me." Her articulation surprised him. Most enslaved people he had encountered spoke in the heavy dialect their masters expected and enforced, but Sarah's speech was careful, almost educated. "You understood the message," he said, and immediately felt foolish for the surprise in his own voice. "I try to understand everything I hear, Father. It's the only education available to me." That simple statement, delivered with such quiet dignity, struck him like a physical blow. Here was a mind starving for knowledge, imprisoned in circumstances that denied her the very thing she craved most. "If you wish to discuss the scriptures further," he heard himself saying, "the church is open for prayer every afternoon." Sarah's eyes met his for the second time, and again he felt that inexplicable connection. "Thank you, Father. I will come when my duties permit." What happened next is something that left me speechless when I first learned about it, because it reveals how easily good intentions can lead us down paths we never imagined we would travel. Sarah began coming to the church 3 afternoons a week. At first, they truly did discuss scripture. Father Whitmore would read passages aloud, and Sarah would ask questions that revealed the depth of her thinking. She wanted to understand the meaning behind the parables, the historical context, the theology. Her questions were more thoughtful than those of many seminary students he had known. Within 2 weeks, Father Whitmore made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "Sarah," he said one afternoon in late July, "would you like to learn to read?" The silence that followed was profound. Sarah's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "Father, that's forbidden. If Master Beaumont discovered it, what we discuss in the house of God is between you, me, and the Lord," he said. "You have a right to read his word for yourself." "I have no rights, Father. I am property." The word hung in the air between them like an accusation. Father Whitmore felt shame burn through him, shame at his own naivety, at the comfortable distance he had maintained from the brutal reality of the system his church tacitly supported. "Here, in this sanctuary, you are a child of God," he said firmly, "and I will teach you to read his word if you wish to learn." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Father, more than anything." The lessons began the following week. Father Whitmore would lock the heavy wooden doors of the church from the inside, and they would sit in the small vestry, away from the windows. He started with the alphabet, watching with amazement as Sarah absorbed everything with a speed that confirmed what he had suspected. She possessed an exceptional mind that had been criminally wasted. By September, Sarah could read simple passages from the Bible. By October, she was reading complete chapters. She arrived at each lesson hungry not just for reading, but for conversation, for the exchange of ideas that had been denied to her entire life. It was during these lessons that Father Whitmore began to see Sarah not as a slave, not as a parishioner, but as a woman, a brilliant, compassionate, extraordinary woman who had been relegated to serving others when she should have been studying at universities, writing, teaching. And Sarah, for her part, saw in Father Whitmore something she had never expected to find. A man who listened to her as if her thoughts mattered, who valued her mind, who treated her with a respect that felt revolutionary. The inevitable happened on a cold evening in November. They had been reading from the Song of Solomon, those passionate verses that speak of love in language both sacred and sensual. Sarah had just finished reading aloud, "I am my beloved's, and his desire is toward me." She looked up from the page and their eyes met. In that moment, all the careful boundaries they had maintained crumbled. "Sarah," he whispered, and the way he said her name was a confession in itself. "Father, we cannot. I know. God help me, I know." But even as he spoke those words, he reached for her hand, and she did not pull away. "This is wrong," she said, but her fingers tightened around his. "Everything about this world is wrong," he replied. "You enslaved, me complicit in my silence, the church that blesses the chains that bind you. Perhaps this, at least, is honest." They did not kiss that night. They simply sat, hands clasped, both trembling with the recognition of what they had acknowledged. When Sarah finally left, slipping out through the side door into the darkness, Father Whitmore knelt before the altar and prayed for strength he knew he did not possess. The affair, if it could be called that, developed slowly over the following months. They did not consummate their feelings physically for nearly half a year. Instead, they existed in a liminal space of emotional intimacy that was perhaps more transgressive than any physical act would have been. Father Whitmore had never experienced intellectual companionship like this. Sarah challenged him, questioned him, made him examine beliefs he had held unexamined his entire life. She asked him how the church could preach love while accepting slavery. She asked him how he could pray for the souls of masters who raped enslaved women with impunity. She asked him if God truly intended some of his children to own others. He had no good answers. His seminary training had not prepared him for these questions. Posed by someone who lived the brutal reality he had only theorized about in abstract theological discussions. By spring of 1859, Father Whitmore knew he was in love with Sarah. Not the pure spiritual love he was supposed to feel for all of God's children, but the consuming, desperate love of a man for a woman. He thought about her constantly. He wrote poetry in his journal that he immediately crossed out, horrified at his own feelings. He invented reasons to visit the Beaumont plantation just to catch a glimpse of her. Sarah felt the same agony. She knew their situation was impossible. Even if Father Whitmore were not a priest, even if she were not enslaved, the gulf between them was uncrossable. Interracial marriage was illegal in Louisiana. A white man who loved a black woman could lose everything. A black woman who loved a white man risked her life. But knowledge of impossibility does not kill love. Sometimes it only makes it burn brighter. On May 3, 1859, everything changed. Sarah arrived at the church for her lesson with bruises on her arms. Father Whitmore noticed immediately. "What happened?" "Nothing, Father. I was clumsy." "Don't lie to me, Sarah, please." She was silent for a long moment. Then the words came tumbling out. The overseer, a brutal man named Jackson, had cornered her in the stable that morning. He had tried to force himself on her. She had fought him off, but he had promised he would return, that next time she would not escape. Father Whitmore felt rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. Pure, white-hot fury that this woman he loved was subjected to daily terror while he lived in comfort and safety. "I'll speak to Beaumont," he said. "No!" Sarah grabbed his arm. "Father, that will only make it worse. Jackson is Beaumont's most efficient overseer. The master will do nothing, and then Jackson will know I complained. He'll kill me, Father. He's done it before to women who resisted him." "Then we'll leave," Father Whitmore heard himself say. "Tonight I'll take you north to freedom." Sarah stared at him. "Father, you cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious about anything in my life. You would give up your vows, your position, everything you've worked for." "What is all of that worth?" he said quietly, "if I stand by while you are destroyed?" In that moment, they both understood that the decision had already been made. Not through careful reasoning or moral deliberation, but through the inexorable logic of love that transcends doctrine and law. They kissed for the first time that evening, in the fading light filtering through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine Church. It was tender and desperate and utterly damning. What happens next is something that I had to verify multiple times, because the plan they devised was both brilliant and extraordinarily dangerous. Father Whitmore began making careful preparations. He had some savings from his modest stipend, enough for passage north. He made discreet inquiries and learned about the Underground Railroad network that operated even in New Orleans, though it was far more dangerous here than in border states. He made contact with a Quaker merchant named Ezra Hayes, who had helped enslaved people escape before. The plan was for Sarah to disappear during the chaos of the St. Joseph's Day celebration on March 19, 1860. In the confusion of the festival, with hundreds of people in the streets, her absence might not be noticed for hours. Father Whitmore would claim he needed to travel to Baton Rouge for diocesan business. Instead, they would meet at a safe house Hayes had identified, and from there begin the dangerous journey north. But they needed time together before that, time to be certain of what they were about to do, time to be together as they never had been. On a February evening in 1860, Sarah came to Father Whitmore's chambers in the rectory for the first time. It was reckless beyond measure. If anyone had seen her enter, both their lives would have been forfeit. "Are you certain?" he asked her when she stood before him in the small room where he slept. "I am certain of nothing except that I love you," she replied, "and I would rather have one night of truth than a lifetime of denial." They made love that night, tenderly and with a passion born of long restraint. Afterward, lying in his narrow bed, Sarah traced the outline of his face with her fingers. "Do you believe God will forgive us?" she asked. "I believe," Father Whitmore said carefully, "that if God is truly love, as the scriptures tell us, then he understands what we feel. And if he does not, Then perhaps he is not the God I have spent my life serving. That sounds like heresy, Father. Perhaps it is. I no longer know what I believe about anything, except that I believe in you, in us. They talked through the night, making plans, sharing fears, allowing themselves to imagine a future that seemed impossibly distant. Sarah would take the name Mary Williams. Father Whitmore would become Thomas Wilson, a merchant. They would settle in Canada, if necessary, where slavery had been abolished decades earlier. "What will you do without the priesthood?" Sarah asked. "It's been your whole life." "I will find a new life," he said. "With you, I can become anything." Sarah came to his chambers 3 more times over the following weeks. Each visit was a desperate gamble. Each time they swore it would be the last, and each time their need for each other overwhelmed their caution. On the night of March 15th, 1860, 4 days before their planned escape, Sarah arrived at Father Whitmore's door shaking with terror. "He knows," she said without preamble. "Jackson knows." Father Whitmore's blood turned to ice. "How?" "He followed me tonight, I'm certain of it. I heard footsteps behind me, and when I turned, he was there in the shadows, watching. He smiled at me, Father. It was the smile of a man who has just discovered a valuable secret." They both understood what this meant. Jackson would go to Beaumont. Sarah would be sold, sent away, possibly killed. Father Whitmore would be ruined, defrocked, possibly prosecuted. "We leave tonight," Father Whitmore said, "right now." "Father, we're not ready. We have each other. That will have to be enough." They gathered what little they could, what small amount of money Father Whitmore had hidden away. He wrote a letter to the Archbishop, trying to explain, knowing no explanation would suffice, and left it on his desk. They slipped out of the rectory at midnight, moving through the dark streets of New Orleans like ghosts. The city was dangerous at night, but the danger they were fleeing was greater than any they might encounter in the darkness. Ezra Hayes was not expecting them, but when they appeared at his door, breathless and terrified, he did not hesitate. He had seen this desperation before, in the eyes of people who had finally chosen freedom over survival. "You'll need to hide here for 2 days," he told them. "I have a ship leaving for Philadelphia on the 18th. The captain is sympathetic to our cause. It will cost everything you have, and even then the risk is enormous. We'll pay whatever is required," Father Whitmore said. They spent those 2 days in a hidden room beneath Hayes's warehouse, barely larger than a closet, listening to the sounds of the city above them and wondering if every footstep was the one that would discover them. On the evening of March 17th, they heard shouting in the street outside, Jackson's voice unmistakable and filled with rage, demanding that Hayes open his warehouse for inspection. "I know you're hiding runaways, Hayes. I've suspected it for months." Ezra Hayes's calm voice. "I'm a merchant, Jackson. I have no interest in your domestic troubles. The priest is missing. The slave Sarah from the Beaumont plantation is missing. Both disappeared the same night. If you're hiding them, you'll hang alongside them." This part of the story particularly struck me when I researched it, because it shows how fragile hope can be, how quickly everything we plan can fall apart. Hayes descended to their hiding place after Jackson had finally left. His face was grim. "They know you're together," he said. "The entire city is searching. Beaumont has offered a $1,000 reward for Sarah's return and is calling for Father Whitmore's arrest. The church has issued a statement denouncing him. You cannot board that ship. Every vessel leaving port is being searched." Sarah began to weep silently. Father Whitmore held her, feeling their dream of freedom crumble around them. "There is one option," Hayes said slowly. "It's desperate, and it may not work." "Tell us," Father Whitmore said. "There's a community of free people of color in the bayou, about 30 miles south of here. They're isolated, suspicious of outsiders, but they've been known to shelter runaways. If you could reach them, you might be able to hide there until this dies down." "And then?" Sarah asked. "And then, perhaps in a few months, we try again." They left Hayes's warehouse that night, traveling on foot through the swamps south of New Orleans. Father Whitmore had lived his entire life in cities. He was utterly unprepared for the brutal reality of the bayou at night, the insects, the mud that sucked at their feet, the sounds of alligators sliding through water nearby. Sarah, who had spent her childhood playing in similar swamps on the Beaumont plantation, guided them through the darkness. She was stronger than him, more capable of surviving this, and the reversal of their roles would have been comical if their situation had not been so desperate. They walked for 3 days, sleeping in brief snatches during daylight hours, always moving, always terrified that the slave catchers were behind them. Father Whitmore's feet were raw and bleeding. They had only the food Hayes had given them, and it ran out after the second day. On the afternoon of March 21st, they finally reached the settlement Hayes had described. It was little more than a cluster of wooden shacks built on stilts above the swamp water, but to them it looked like salvation. The residents regarded them with deep suspicion. A white man and an enslaved woman claiming to be in love, asking for shelter. It sounded like a trap, but there was a woman in the settlement named Marie who had escaped from slavery herself 20 years earlier. She looked into Sarah's eyes and saw something she recognized, the desperation of someone who had gambled everything on freedom. "You can stay," Marie said, "but if you bring trouble to us, we'll turn you over ourselves. We have families to protect." They lived in that settlement for 3 months. Father Whitmore worked alongside the men, learning to fish and trap in the bayou. Sarah helped the women with cooking and child rearing. Slowly, the settlement's suspicion eased. They saw that this strange couple was genuine, that the white priest truly loved this black woman, that they were willing to give up everything to be together. It was in that settlement, in a tiny shack that leaked when it rained, that Sarah told Father Whitmore she was pregnant. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I'm certain," she said. "I've known for 2 weeks, but I was afraid to tell you." Father Whitmore took her hands in his. "Afraid? Sarah, this is a blessing." "A blessing?" Tears streamed down her face. "Thomas, we're fugitives. We have nothing. How can we bring a child into this?" It was the first time she had called him by his given name, without the title Father. He realized that he had not heard his own name, spoken with love in over a year. "We'll find a way," he said. "People have raised children in worse circumstances." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. They could not stay in the settlement forever. They had no future here, living on the charity of people who had little to spare. They needed to try again to reach the north, but now Sarah was pregnant, which would make the journey even more dangerous. In June of 1860, Ezra Hayes sent word through his network that a window of opportunity had opened. A steamship was leaving for Boston, and its captain was willing to hide fugitives in a secret compartment below deck. It would cost every penny Father Whitmore had left, and there was no guarantee of success, but it might be their only chance. They said goodbye to Marie and the settlement that had sheltered them. Marie pressed a small bundle of herbs into Sarah's hands. "For the baby," she said, "may he be born free." The journey back to New Orleans took 2 days. They arrived at night, moving through the city they had fled 3 months earlier like thieves. Hayes hid them in a different location this time, in the back room of a laundry run by a woman who asked no questions. The ship was scheduled to leave on June 29th. On June 28th, disaster struck. Jackson, who had never stopped searching, had been watching Hayes. He had paid informants throughout the city, people who would report any unusual activity. When Hayes made arrangements for passage for 2 people matching Father Whitmore and Sarah's description, one of those informants went straight to Jackson. Father Whitmore and Sarah were arrested in the laundry at dawn, dragged out by Jackson and 3 other slave catchers before they could even understand what was happening. Sarah was taken to the parish prison to await trial for theft of herself. Under Louisiana law, an enslaved person who ran away was guilty of stealing the master's property, namely themselves. Father Whitmore was taken to the diocesan residence to await judgment from the church. They were not allowed to say goodbye. The last thing Father Whitmore saw was Sarah being pushed into a wagon, her hands chained, her eyes searching for his in the chaos. She did not cry out. She held his gaze until the wagon turned the corner and she was gone. The church's response was swift and severe. Father Whitmore was defrocked in a private ceremony that took less than an hour. The Archbishop himself presided, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have betrayed your vows, betrayed your calling, and brought scandal upon the church," the Archbishop said. "You are no longer a priest, you are nothing. Father Whitmore, standing in the same vestments he had worn to say Mass hundreds of times, felt something break inside him. Not regret, not shame, but a strange sense of relief. He was no longer Father Whitmore. He was simply Thomas, a man who loved a woman. "I would do it again," he said quietly. "Everything. I would choose her again." The Archbishop's expression did not change. "You will be prosecuted for your crimes. The Beaumont family is calling for your imprisonment." Thomas Whitmore was held in a cell in the city jail, awaiting trial. The charges were numerous: aiding a fugitive slave, theft, fornication, and a charge unique to Louisiana called debauchement, which carried a sentence of up to 10 years. But Thomas did not care about any of that. His only thought was of Sarah, imprisoned somewhere in the same city, carrying his child, facing a fate he could not bear to imagine. On July 15, 1860, Thomas received a visitor. It was Ezra Hayes, looking older and more tired than he had 3 months earlier. "I have news," Hayes said without preamble. "Sarah was sold." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. Sold? To whom? "A plantation owner in Mississippi. He purchased her 2 days ago. She's already been transported." "No." Thomas gripped the bars of his cell. "No, they can't. She's pregnant. She's carrying my child." Hayes's expression was full of pity. "The buyer knows that. Enslaved women who are pregnant are worth more. The child will be born enslaved." Thomas sank to the floor of his cell. His child, his and Sarah's child, would be born into slavery, would never know freedom, would be owned by a stranger from the moment of birth. "I'm sorry," Hayes said. "I tried to find a way to reach her, but there was nothing I could do." After Hayes left, Thomas Whitmore sat in his cell and felt something inside him die. Not his love for Sarah, that would endure until his last breath, but his hope, his belief that there could be any justice in this world. His trial was held on August 3rd, 1860. It was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, eager to see the fallen priest who had committed the unforgivable sin of loving across the color line. Thomas did not defend himself. When asked if he regretted his actions, he said simply, "I regret that I did not act sooner. I regret every moment I spent upholding a system that destroys human beings. I regret that I cannot be with the woman I love, but I do not regret loving her." The judge sentenced him to 7 years hard labor. Thomas was sent to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Baton Rouge, where he spent the next 4 years breaking rocks under the brutal sun. He thought about Sarah every moment of every day. He wondered if she had survived childbirth. He wondered if his child was alive. He imagined a boy or girl he would never meet, growing up enslaved, never knowing that their father had once been a priest who gave up everything for love. In April of 1865, the Civil War ended. In the chaos that followed, many prisoners were released, including Thomas. He was 39 years old, but he looked 20 years older. Prison had broken his body, though not his spirit. The first thing Thomas did upon his release was to search for Sarah. He traveled to Mississippi to the plantation where she had been sold. The overseer, a different man than Jackson, told him that Sarah had died in childbirth in January of 1861. "The baby?" Thomas asked, barely able to form the words. "Baby girl survived. She's in the fields now, about 4 years old." Thomas felt joy and anguish war within him. He had a daughter. Sarah was gone. "I want to see her," he said. "Can't do that," the overseer said. "She's property of Mr. Thornton." But Thomas had not come this far to be denied. That night he snuck into the slave quarters. He found his daughter sleeping on a pallet on the floor, a tiny girl with Sarah's eyes. He could not take her. The war might be over, but chaos still reigned. If he tried to take her by force, he would be arrested or shot. But he sat beside her through the night, watching her sleep, memorizing every feature. When dawn came, he kissed her forehead gently, whispered, "Your mother loved you. I love you," and left before anyone could discover him. Thomas spent the next year working odd jobs, saving every penny. When the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865, officially ending slavery, he returned to Mississippi. This time, he had money and legal standing. He found the man who now owned his daughter, and negotiated her purchase. It cost him everything he had, but on February 14, 1866, Thomas Whitmore walked out of Mississippi with his 4-year-old daughter. He named her Sarah after her mother. They traveled north to Pennsylvania, where Thomas found work as a schoolteacher. He never told his daughter the full truth of her origins, not wanting to burden her with the knowledge of all that had been lost. He told her only that her mother had been a remarkable woman who had died bringing her into the world, which was true enough. Thomas raised Sarah alone, giving her the education her mother had craved. Sarah grew up to become a teacher herself, working in schools for freed slaves in the Reconstruction South. She married a minister and had 3 children of her own. Thomas Whitmore lived to see his grandchildren, which was more than he had ever dared to hope for. He never remarried. He kept a small portrait that a traveling artist had sketched of the original Sarah from his description, based on his memories. He would look at it every night before sleep, remembering the woman who had changed his understanding of everything: love, faith, sacrifice, and what it meant to be truly human. On September 12, 1881, Thomas Whitmore was found dead in his small house in Philadelphia. He was 55 years old. His daughter Sarah found him in his bed, peaceful, with that small portrait clutched in his hand. Beside his body, written on the floor in what appeared to be wine, was a single word: Sarah. He had spent his final moments writing her name, a final act of devotion to the woman he had loved and lost. Among his papers, Sarah found a letter he had written years earlier but never sent, addressed simply to my Sarah. In it he had written, "They say I betrayed my vows, betrayed the church, betrayed everything I was supposed to hold sacred. But I learned from you that there is only one truly sacred thing in this world, the courage to love across every boundary that hatred erects. I became a better man through loving you. I became, finally, a good man. If God judges me for that, then I will stand before him with no regrets." The church never acknowledged Father Thomas Whitmore again. His name was struck from all official records. In the official history of St. Augustine Parish, there is simply a gap where his tenure should be listed, as if he had never existed at all. But he did exist. He and Sarah both existed. They loved in a time and place that forbade their love. They chose each other despite knowing the cost. And through their daughter and her children, something of their love endured. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If you found it meaningful, please leave a like. Now I want to ask you, have you heard family stories like this? Do your ancestors have similar experiences from this period? I'd love to hear about them in the comments. And please tell me your location. Where are you watching from today? Your city, state, or country? Your engagement means everything to this channel.